Welcome to Wellness with John, resources to help you thrive. I'm John Peters. And in this video, I'm going to answer a question that people sometimes pose, which is what's the difference between counseling, therapy, and coaching? Or is there a difference? Stay tuned. Okay, so I'm a therapist primarily, although I'm also a coach. And in the past, I have worn other hats. I was a mediator for over 10 years as part of my career at one point, which is not the same thing as therapy or the same thing as coaching. But sometimes people ask me, what's the difference between counseling and therapy, or what's the difference between therapy and coaching? And people also sometimes just use the terms, especially therapy and counseling, interchangeably. But there are times when it does matter to make that distinction. And so that's what I wanted to make this video about, is just explaining the technical differences between those three terms so that you're an informed consumer and understand just why we differentiate those. The main thing to understand about those three terms is that the one that is distinct for a few reasons is therapy. So therapy is a term that refers to treatment in the medical sense. And so each state of all 50 states has legislation that defines what therapy is. So therapy and psychotherapy are defined by the law to mean certain things. And this is why to be a psychotherapist, you have to get a credential, which means you have to satisfy the state professional board after you graduate with your appropriate degree in order to get the credential, and then you have to maintain that credential in order to do therapy. And so there are people out there who are kind of quasi-therapists, and they're mostly in the coaching field, who are kind of doing therapy, but they're not calling themselves a therapist because they don't want to break the law. But here's the issue. If you need reimbursement via an EAP or your health insurance, forms have to be submitted, and those forms have to include the date of service and type of service, of course, but they also have to include a diagnosis. Okay, so the way that the states define the laws and the way the state professional boards oversee the policies related to those laws is that the only people allowed to diagnose are medical professionals diagnosing within the scope of their practice, right? So as a psychotherapist, I can diagnose psychiatric issues, but I can't diagnose you with skin cancer or some sort of other medical issue. So diagnosis doesn't mean freedom to diagnose anything medical. It means that you can legitimately diagnose within the scope of your credential. Okay. So as a psychotherapist, you can diagnose the array of psychiatric disorders, although again, it's within scope of practice. So there's certain types of things, like I don't get into fine-tuning diagnoses between different types of dementia because psychiatrists and neurologists are more competent at that than I am. But in general, we therapists are most often diagnosing different types of anxiety disorders, different types of mood disorders like depression, bipolar disorder, and things like that. So basically, if you want legitimate diagnosis, evaluation, treatment for a psychiatric issue in the context of wanting to get reimbursement from your insurance policy, there's going to have to be a diagnosis on that form, and the provider's credentials are going to have to be on that form, or else the insurance is going to kick it out. So you can't have your neighbor wake up and sign your insurance forms and say, I diagnosed you with something and I saw you, and so, reimburse for this bill. You have to have a professional with a valid credential, and you have to have a diagnosis, and you have to have the proper diagnostic or proper code for the type of service. So psychiatric intake and 45 minutes of therapy, things like that. If you don't have the proper state sanctioned credential, you're not allowed to do that. And that whole thing is called therapy. So a therapist is someone with the state credential who can do therapy, which in this sense is going to include the ability to diagnose and assign a diagnostic category, let's say generalized anxiety disorder, and to be able to say, I did a psychiatric evaluation, which is the type of service, and then affix their information on the form that says, I'm the one who did it as the professional who did that service. So, so one instance where you need a therapist and you don't want a coach or a counselor is when you have to have someone with a professional credential because you're seeking reimbursement either through insurance or an EAP. Now, the second case where you need a therapist is when you have some sort of function involved with the courts that is saying thou shalt go to therapy. So, people sometimes get involved in domestic issues, and then the judge makes an order that says you have to get X number of sessions of anger management counseling. That really is therapy. They often use the word counseling, but they're really talking about proper therapy. Sometimes people going through divorce are ordered to get therapy. So sometimes you have a diversion program as part of probation, things like that. So when you have some formal probation or judge ordered thing that says go get counseling, it's really typically meaning therapy, because you have to be getting something that is technical enough to satisfy whatever the requirement is. But also, you generally want something that is robust in terms of professional and precise of the type of service you would get from an actual therapist, because if that gets challenged in some way, it's really a therapist, not a counselor or a coach, who can back up, yeah, I did see this person, here's what I think about them, and here's how it comes to bear on whatever this thing is that they're dealing with, probation or the court or whatever. So that's the second case where you really want a therapist, not a coach or a counselor. The third one, in terms of why would you want a therapist and not a coach or a counselor, is often if someone for themselves is thinking, you know what, my issues really are complicated enough and likely have components of frank psychiatric stuff like anxiety or depression, that I need a competent person to parse out what's going on with me and the different parts of what's going on with me in order to get adequate treatment and referrals and things like that. And so sometimes people are motivated to get the higher level of expertise of a therapist over a counselor or a coach in order to be satisfied that they're getting competent care. And that's also true if, like, you, for a family member, saying, hey, I want you to go get therapy. Often you're more satisfied if the person goes and gets therapy proper, as opposed to talking with a counselor or coach. And the main reason, to get to those other two terms, is that there is no state oversight to the terms counseling or coaching, okay? So your neighbor could wake up today and decide that they are a coach. They could also hang out a shingle and say, I'm a counselor, right? So counseling and coaching are not regulated by the state the way the term therapy and psychotherapy is, all right? So obviously that means that there's no quality control in terms of state mechanisms overseeing people doing coaching and counseling the way there is for therapy. Because as a therapist, I could lose my license to practice therapy if I behave badly and get sanctioned by the state professional board, right? So that can't happen. If I'm a coach and I behave badly, who's going to sanction me? You can't take away my credential because I don't have a credential if I'm a coach. Same thing with counseling, okay? So people who are called counselors are either specialized people who are like pastoral counselors in a congregation, or career counselors who focus on career development, right? Or people who are, again, quasi therapists who don't have a credential who want to call themselves some sort of counselor. So, um, counselor is this fairly broad term that just means somebody who will talk to you about some type of issue and give you support. But the assumption is that they're not doing therapy. So they're not diagnosing you and they're not treating you in the proper sense that we use the word treatment for a medical condition, including psychiatric conditions, right? So if you go to a counselor, if you go to your pastoral counselor in your congregation, you can't turn in that hour that you talked with that person to your insurance and get reimbursed, okay? Similarly, you can't expect that they diagnosed you properly with anxiety and are treating you for anxiety, even though anxious people go talk to counselors and it is helpful. I'm not poo pooing the function and effects of counseling. I'm just saying that there is tight control over what is therapy in ways that doesn't exist for counseling. Okay. The other thing about coaching is coaching, it's variously defined, and there's an evolution in the coaching niche of our culture to get a little more defined about what coaching is. But basically, coaching is support for a broader domain of issues than what people tend to bring to therapy, even though those issues may be highly related to the things that people would bring to therapy, right? So, to make that clear, a person might say, look, I want to work on myself. I want to grow. I want to be a good person. I want to be able to get clarity in my career goals. I want to learn how to lower my stress and be happier. In that case, a coach may be absolutely fine, as long as you're not dealing with, one, trying to get reimbursed by your insurance, and two, you're not dealing with something that really ought to be dealt with by a professional. So you're generally functioning well. Coaching is supportive of lots of people, and there are lots of different kinds of coaches out there. So if you end up shopping for coaches at some point, definitely do your homework. You probably need a referral from a friend who saw someone, or see the person once or twice just to see, is it a good fit in terms of what your expectations are of the process and what that coach has to offer. So in my case, in my current practice, I call myself a therapist and I call myself a coach. Why do I do this? Because I do therapy. I've been doing therapy for 26 years. But it's also true that I do coaching. So I do see people who um, don't require a diagnosis in order for us to do what we're going to do together. And not because I'm ignoring their diagnosis necessarily, but what I'm doing with them is not treating their diagnosis. I'm focusing on issues that wouldn't be reimbursed by the insurance because the insurance company wouldn't consider it treatment because A, I'm not diagnosing them, and B, I'm not focusing on the issues related to their diagnosis if they happen to have one. So an example of that would be, let's say you have somebody who actually is clinically anxious, okay? They have a diagnosis of anxiety. Their doctor prescribes them Prozac or something, and they take it for anxiety. So they actually have a diagnosis. But they come to me and they say, hey, John, look, I want to just learn about how to be more successful at following through with my goals and following my wellness program and learning some ways to deal with interpersonal conflict with my partner. I can do that with them as a coach because we are not focusing on and treating their anxiety, even though those things obviously are going to be interfaced with how their anxiety functions for them. But I'm just coaching them on stuff that is part of their meaningful life, but not necessarily diagnosing and treating their anxiety. Okay. So coaching could be seen as more broad and not necessarily directly focused on the psychiatric diagnosis and treatment of such. Now, one domain that people often get into, and this is kind of a gray area, a lot of people reasonably go seek a therapist, counselor, coach for relationship issues. Okay. And the tricky thing about trying to do that for a lot of people is that when they want to use their insurance, technically, insurance does not pay and reimburse for treatment of marital issues. And the reason for this is if the only thing that you're bringing to the process is marital issues, that's really the only thing that can be identified. And it may be a reasonable thing to identify and a very reasonable reason to go to get services. But if that's the only thing, that is not a psychiatric diagnosis, okay? There is a code for that, but insurance companies won't reimburse for that type of code. If we say partner relational problems, that's not a psychiatric diagnosis. You're not mentally ill if you have relationship problems. In fact, you're a normal person because all of us do in one way or another, right? But or many ways. So the thing is, when people go to get couples counseling and they want to use their insurance for it, the technical thing that the therapist has to do, if you're going to get reimbursed, you're going to see a therapist. And what that therapist has to do is identify that at least one person in the process actually does have a diagnosis, and the relational stuff that's being primarily focused on in the couples counseling is logically supportive of helping that person ameliorate whatever suffering they have related to that diagnosis. That's kind of technical, and it enters into kind of an ethical gray area, which means as a therapist, is it always legit to sign those forms so they can get reimbursement if I'm not really treating the anxiety of one of the partners? Personally, I think it's tricky. And as a therapist has been doing this for a long time, do I see couples in that way? Yes, some of the time. But in general, if you're going to get couples counseling, you're often going to have to pay out of pocket because even if it's a legit therapist who has a proper credential, they may not be able to justify that what you're doing together actually is supportive of treatment for a diagnosis that at least one of you has in the process. So that's kind of the catch there of trying to get reimbursement for couples counseling. Because in general, historically, insurance companies don't want to pay for couples counseling. They just don't. They want to pay for individual counseling. They will pay for family and couples sessions if it's supporting the treatment of a diagnosis that one of the individuals in the process has. But that, again, raises some tricky questions about ethics of using all those concepts and whether or not the reimbursement is legitimately reimbursing for what it's supposed to, okay? So at the time of this video, I am a therapist. I am a coach. Today, I am currently accepting new patients. So if you happen to be interested in working with me, feel free to check out my link to my website, johnpeters.online. I'll put it in the description. But but if you're seeking services, just know that's kind of the ways that these terms are defined in terms of the types of services that people wearing these 3 different hats provides to clients. Okay. So hopefully this is helpful. If you like this kind of content, definitely hit the like button below. If you have yet to subscribe to my channel, please do so because it helps me grow this channel. If you leave comments below, that helps me understand the types of content that people like and the types of content I need to produce for the channel in the future. And if you especially like one of my videos, stick it on your social media to share it so others can enjoy it as well. So thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you in an upcoming video.